Our next lecture, well, really just a short overview, is about integrated development environments. So IPython notebooks are great for testing, great for exploring, especially if you have large amounts of data that you want to visualize, comment. They're actually quite decent for reproducible research. You could have the setup of your simulation, the analysis of your simulation, and the text explaining what you actually do all in one notebook that you can give to somebody else who can then actually run the notebook and repeat what you did. I don't think they are the greatest way of actually writing complex software. There are simply features that were used from development environments these days that are missing. And it's not the autocompletion. The autocompletion of IPython notebooks is actually quite, Jupyter notebooks is quite excellent. So what is an IDE? Well, for some people, this is the only IDE they'll ever need. Vim actually can be set up quite nicely as a Python IDE. The code completion, autocompletion, is quite good. And it will even give you, for functions, it will open like a little section of the window on top where it shows you the doc string. Of course, you can also do debugging from within Vim or VI and all kinds of other things. For VI, if you want to do that, uCompleteMe is actually a very good completion engine there. Others might want a more clickable environment. But before we get to that, let me just briefly summarize what I mean if I talk about an IDE. What are the minimum requirements that I see that when I would start calling something an IDE? An IDE should give me syntax highlighting and autocompletion with tooltips. That's not very integrated yet, but that's like a minimum. There should be a tree view of the files and methods so that I can quickly move around within my code. I should be able to run and debug, because otherwise it's not integrated. So that, for me, is like the real minimum. And actually, these days, I expect integrated version control. Actually, for multiple version control systems, I mean, Git, Subversion, Mercurial, I think those are so common these days that all IDEs should support them. This is not going to be an overview of all IDEs. There's a wiki page for that. Just a few that I'm using every once in a while. KDEVELOP, it's a KDE application. It's also available for Mac and Windows. KDEVELOP is currently my favorite C++ IDE. It uses a compiler framework underneath to analyze C++ code. It's also quite a decent Python IDE, although it still has some autocompletion problems sometimes, where dictionaries are completed as Python 2 dictionaries and not Python 3. But other than that, it has all the features that I required. It does nice tooltips. It even figures out, well, in this case, no. So it even will figure out the types of arguments, both from the doc string here. So here it gets it from the doc string, but also if you have type hints in your code. Who has ever used type hints in their Python code? Who knows what that is? Okay. Python 3.6, I think, introduced type hints. They are mostly meant for IDEs, actually. And you can give them as in your function arguments. So when you usually would write def foo a, you can now write def foo a colon float. And then the IDE will know that it's a float, which can be useful for further analysis. OK, so KDEVELOP, decent with some flaws. By the way, Python is Unicode. So you can write beta, for example. Visual Studio Code. Yes, it's Microsoft. It is an open source project. Actually, the whole Python environment, even within Visual Studio, is open source from the get-go. They kind of hired the developer of the environment, and one of the requirements that he set out was it remains open source. Visual Studio Code actually is a good IDE for Python in the meantime. It is the only free IDE that allows, that I know, that allows debugging of mixed code. So you can, in a nice integrated way, so you can debug your Python extension or your C extension next to your Python code. It does support remote debugging and all the other features that I mentioned for Python, or that I mentioned for an IDE. They are also working on remote editing. KDEVELOP supports remote editing, at least under Linux, through SFTP. But that's really just moving the files back and forth. It has some features if you have a complete KDEVELOP installation on the other side that also allow you to run code remotely. But that's getting kind of incomplete. Their goal is to build a remote editing environment that basically changes the environment. So we'll not look at your local packages, but at your remote packages and do auto-completion based on your remote environment, your remote packages that are available. When they get that going, that would be pretty neat. Eric is a good IDE with a horrible documentation. The user documentation is pretty much non-existent. Its API documentation is decent, so you can figure out how to program it, but figuring out how to actually do something within the IDE that is not obvious is very hard. If you figure it out, though, it's quite a nice IDE. PyCharm exists both as a open source and a commercial version. The community edition is open source. It's developed by the people at JetBrains. And it also takes the PEP very serious. So here, for example, argument name should be lowercase. Shadows name f from outer. This is actually quite useful. So here it says, OK, this has been seen already in outside of this function. Otherwise, it has all the features that you would expect from an IDE. I already mentioned there's more. Eclipse with PyDev. And since Eclipse also supports remote debugging and execution, it does that in PyDev as well, although it's not quite that trivial to use. Spider, I know that some of you are using it. Wing IDE, it's commercial and actually not cheap. There is a personal version. Under Windows, Visual Studio, and especially, so Visual Studio Code Community Edition is free. You can use it for open source projects, but you couldn't use it for your work. If you are being paid for what you do and it's not open source, you cannot use the Community Edition. But other than that, if either you have a license or you can use the community edition, it's actually a good IDE under Windows. I have the same problems with it as I have with Eclipse. The project management is too bulky for my taste, but other than that, it's fine. If you want more, there is actually a wiki page on the Python wiki that lists the integrated environments. All right, questions regarding the IDEs?
What's your favorite?
I'm sorry?
What's your favorite?
I still don't have one. I keep jumping around, I have to admit. So, but the ones that I'm currently using are KDEVELOP, Visual Studio Code, and Vim. So those are the three that I really use most.